Hi all, this is Neto. I am here to talk to you and introduce you a little more formally to DNA. We've been talking a lot about DNA in our forensic lab, but we've been kind of glossing over the real definition of it and what it really is used for. I know a lot of you are familiar with DNA from your like watching television, CSI, and probably have heard about it from other classes, but I wanted to kind of go over a more formal introduction. So, what is DNA? The real name for it is deoxyribonucleic acid. And where is it found? So, kind of going from our system of order, we've talked a lot about that, so I'm going to just take off from the cell. If you go inside a cell, you're going to go look specifically inside the organelle called the nucleus. And then within the nucleus, you'll actually find DNA. And the DNA is going to be wound up so tightly into what we would call chromosomes. So here, this picture is kind of misleading because it's saying that the DNA is found inside the chromosomes, but really, the DNA is the chromosome. Chromosome is just an organization of keeping the DNA from tangling on itself, and we'll look a little closer at that in the next few weeks. So, what has DNA? And this kind of ties back to our first day of class when I asked you what was living versus non living. And the answer really came down to anything that is living will have DNA. So, all living objects have DNA. Humans, bacteria, flowers, um, any kind of animal, any kind of plant life, any kind of microorganism will have DNA. A rock will not have DNA, is not living. And then the big controversy or the big subjective question is whether or not a virus is living or non-living. And many of you wrote about this the first week of school. And the answer really comes down to sometimes a virus has DNA and sometimes a virus has RNA. So that is kind of how you guys want to classify it. We kind of left that open for your interpretation. But as far as whether or not a virus has DNA, that actually is dependent on the virus. What is DNA? So I kind of just want to remind you that DNA is a molecule. So when we are looking at the system of order and we were looking at what makes up organelles, molecules make up the organelles. And so DNA is a molecule, and I just wanted to kind of familiarize you with some other molecules that you know about. So oxygen and hydrogen, which are two elements from the periodic table, make up the water molecule. And then oxygen and carbon makes up the carbon dioxide molecule. And then like two oxygens make up oxygen, so that we breathe. So just to kind of take you back to what is DNA. It's a molecule, and those are some other molecules that you're familiar with. And then even more familiar with, you guys should be looking at macromolecules. This is not a new term for you. And there are 4 macromolecules that make up our body. And we are really familiar with 3 of them, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, primarily because those are all macromolecules that we relate to that we eat. Carbohydrates, we spent a lot of time looking at those, specifically glucose and following glucose in our body. So I know that we spent a lot of time with that in our nutrition unit. And then we did touch upon proteins with Miss Wagner when she came in and talked to us about how proteins are helpful for muscle building in personal training. But DNA is actually part of the macromolecule group that we're not as familiar with, which is the nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are actually DNA and RNA. That's the only thing that makes up nucleic acids. And so today we're obviously talking about DNA. So always we want to make sure that we are understanding the structure of what we're learning. So the structure of DNA Most importantly and most basically, we should know that DNA is a double helix, meaning that it takes on this ladder format that then spins on itself. This pink ribbon, which is then matched over here with this purple ribbon, is actually a 5-carbon sugar phosphate group that alternates. And then in the middle, which here we're looking at different colors, and again here are our nitrogenous bases. And our nitrogenous bases are going to be either made up of pyrimidines or purines. If we look here, this single one is a pyrimidine, and this double one is a purine. And you will never see two purines matched up, and you'll never see two pyrimidines matched up. And this is how our double helix stays balanced, because you always have the one matching up with two. And then if you look over here, again, you can kind of see the cytosine is a pyrimidine, and the thymine is a pyrimidine because it's a single molecule, and then the guanine and the adenine is this double. And so those are our 4 different nitrogenous bases, the nitrogen bases. You are going to be responsible for knowing all 4 of those, so please make note of that. And we will be also looking at the next page, but basically CG are always partnered and AT are always partnered. So even though you want to always make sure you have a purine with a pyrimidine, you would never have CA. Those two would never be partnered. So key point again are the rules of base pairing, or the nucleotide basing pairing, are that the ATs are paired together and the CGs are paired together. So I like to remember it with the AT-AT Imperial Walker for all of our Star Wars fans out there, or the Skarsgård lightsaber, CG lightsaber. Okay. And then also just going back here with this structure of the DNA, looking at the hydrogen bonds in the middle. So this is really important, especially as we start to talk about replication, because in order for DNA to replicate itself, it needs to break apart. And so we want it to break apart pretty easily. So we want, and it would break apart here with the purines and pyridines. So the hydrogen bond is actually a pretty weak bond, and so it allows it to break apart. Whereas here, our bonds on this backbone, the phosphate and the 5-carbon sugar, that's a really strong bond. It's a covalent bond. For all of our chemistry students out there, you should know that word, covalent bond. And that's a really strong bond because we do not want that to break. Okay. So of course, since we talked about the structure of DNA, we need to look at the function of DNA. So DNA has 3 major functions, and we're going to be going over these functions a lot more in detail in the next week or 2. The first function is gene coding, and genes is basically like the heredity that transferred from parent to offspring, and it determines a lot of our characteristics, such as our eye color, our hair color, and whatnot. So your DNA is what determines that. Another function of DNA is it codes for proteins, aka amino acids. And these are not the proteins that we eat, or the proteins that we're talking about necessarily in our muscle. However, it is making up those muscles. But proteins are used for many functions in our body. Making enzymes. We are very familiar with all the enzymes in our body at this point. Looking at cellular respiration and digestive system, you should be very familiar with enzymes and coenzymes. Hormones, immune response, cellular repair, and other molecules. So all of these kind of molecules are actually made from proteins, and the proteins are coded from DNA. And that's a whole process that we're actually going to get into great detail about. So it's going to be another kind of cellular respiration exploration type of deal. And then lastly, DNA replication. So DNA replication is vital for reproduction, maintenance of maintenance and growth of cells, tissue, and body systems. So, for example, if you cut yourself and your skin needs to repair itself, you won't get that new cell growth, that new skin growth without DNA replication. So, thinking about how often you are growing hair, thinking about how often you may cut yourself and that you actually scab things over, that all has to do with DNA replication. So how is the structure of DNA related to the function? So the sequencing of our nitrogenous bases, the ATGC, that all depends on that. Basically, the sequencing of it actually determines what proteins you would make and where those proteins would be shipped off in your body. So that's really an important factor. The molecules are really long. Why is this molecule so long? Because it stores so much information. The base pairing also needs to be complementary for being able to replicate it. So that makes it a little bit more complicated to replicate, but also stops it from having as many mistakes or malfunctions. The double helix itself gives the molecule a lot of stability, and then again, the hydrogen bond that we talked about earlier allows for easy copying and reading of the information. So everything about the structure of how DNA is actually purposeful for its function. FYI, that might be a test question later on. And then fun facts about DNA. Our DNA sequence would fill up about 200 1,000 page New York City telephone directories, which I don't even know if you guys know what telephone directories are. That makes me feel old, but nonetheless, that's a lot of DNA. It also, a complete 3 billion base genome would take about 3 gigabytes of storage space. So for all of our computer people, that actually makes less sense to me, but I think it might make more sense to you. And then this one, I mean, if it's unwound and tied together, a strand of DNA in one cell could stretch almost 6 feet, but it'd be only 1/50 trillionth of an inch wide. And if you unwrap the DNA on all your cells, you can actually reach the moon 6,000 times. That's crazy. And then 99% of our DNA sequence is the same in all humans, which I think is fascinating because that means that we are so similar at a molecular level. Yet, that 1% is what determines why we all look so different in many ways as well. So those are our fun facts for DNA. That is our brief intro to DNA. So for a little bit more details, you're going to watch the next flip video. And if you have any questions, please ask Neto. Thanks. Bye.